Thank you very much for the introduction. It's an absolute pleasure to be here, so thank you very much to Ludo and the organisers for inviting me here to speak to you today. My name is Becky. I'm from the University of Leeds and I manage the Electron microscopy facility. So for those of you who haven't visited the beautiful, though not quite as beautiful as Leiden, city of Leeds, we're based just north of the city centre in the building that you can see just behind me, which is a concrete monolith of a building. And this is where our facility is based. So this is a grade 2-star listed building, which means it's of special historical significance. And for those of you who have had the fortune of designing a building from scratch and making sure that you can basically make all the rooms and all the layouts according to your needs rather than what was in the building before, that is fantastic. But unfortunately, we ended up having to renovate a space that was already available to us. And that meant we had to make use of some of the original features. So this building actually used to be the old School of Communication at the University of Leeds. And so we actually renovated an old television studio space, a radio studio space. That's just the entrance. So we had 2 Titan Cryoses installed back in 2016 now, and here you can see a time lapse of our installation of our Cryos 2. And here you get a feel for the space that we're using. So we have this double height studio space, and then just behind you can see that there is a director's deck essentially above the Cryos room, so that you can look down on the Cryoses while you're setting up the collection. So again, having that control room means the users kind of can sit behind and perform their setups in a nice office environment. So it's a very, very nice environment to sit in. So as I said, these instruments were both installed back in 2016 now. We have two Cryoses, so Cryos 1 with a Falcon 3 direct electron detector, and Cryos 2 with a K2 energy filtered with a phase plate. These microscopes arrived as part of a £17 million investment in structural biology by the University of Leeds and the Wellcome Trust. And it was prior to the arrival of these instruments, we had a JL 1400, a T12, and an F20. So, we were doing Cryo-EM, but not on anywhere near this kind of scale. So the arrival of these 2 microscopes was really a game changer for us. So we officially opened up back in 2017 now. And I should mention that we are directed by Ranson, who's that guy there. And so we opened back in 2017 now. Here's the Cryoses in the tidiest this room has ever been. At the moment, there's an SEM at the back of it, so this is a slightly old photo now. But yes, we have the 2 microscopes in the studio space, not quite as efficiently crammed in as they are in EVIC. And then upstairs in the control room, we have the stations where we can control the machines. So this technology sits within the wider facility where we have, so we're a university facility, so we serve a broad community of users who might be interested in doing anything from resin embedding and sectioning of cells through to high-resolution cryo-EM of macromolecular complexes, which is obviously what we do a lot of. So in terms of other equipment, we have 3 other transmission electron microscopes, our JL 1400, our T12 and our F20. So in theory, we can do some cryo screening on our T12 and our F20, but in reality, that is dropping off and becoming less and less of the activity on those microscopes, and that's something I'll touch on when I talk about training a bit later. In terms of sample preparation of macromolecular complexes, we have Leica EM-GP and a Vitrobot Mark IV, and these are both housed in a 20% relative humidity room, which was one of the big battles to get this humidity-controlled room in place when we were doing the refurbishment of the space. It's made an absolutely huge improvement to the quality of specimens which we're able to produce. So before, we had these microscopes housed in a room which was essentially the outside humidity. For those of you who don't know Leeds very well, hot, sunny, dry days are not in the majority. Typically our relative humidity would have been between 40 and 60% in our sample preparation room. So moving down to a room where typically we're at about 13 to 15% means we're seeing much cleaner samples. You can take your time a little bit more. It's not quite so critical to keep all your nitrogen covered all of the time. That was a really nice thing to get in place. I'm sure many of you are aware of some of the new exciting technologies in terms of sample preparation that are coming online, Spot-Aton and Chameleon and Vitrajet. But at Leeds, we have, so in the group of STEAMunch in collaboration with Howard White, we are doing some work on a spraying device to enable time-resolved electron microscopy. So this system has the potential to go really quite fast. We're talking time resolution down to about sort of 10 milliseconds, which is faster than the Vitrajet or Chameleon might be able to produce, but with the drawbacks that you're having to spray your specimens. You're having to use a system similar to a mass spectrometer to get your sample into these little droplets and then to fire those at the grids. So I can just show you a very quick video. This one here. So the grids are essentially, and I'm going to turn the sound off. So basically the grid is held by these tweezers here, and the nozzle for the spray is about here, and then in a minute you'll see the spraying process will begin, and the grid goes through the spray and then hits the surface. And we're currently evaluating the performance of this device, but I think it's a really exciting technology. And we've had a couple of projects now where we're using traditional filter paper-based blotting techniques. We haven't been able to get any success in terms of a decent particle distribution, and using this technology, it looks like it's definitely giving us some improvements, as well as obviously opening up realms of rapid mixing and the initiation of reactions, because so much of our biology and our interesting biological questions can be triggered by, for example, a change in pH, the addition of a cofactor or a substrate. So this is, from a sample preparation perspective, something very exciting for us. And just to mention briefly, another big area of growth for us as a facility, and especially for me, because this is not my background, is the arrival of some new equipment for the sample preparation of cells and tissues, so high-pressure freezer, freeze substitution, and Cryo-EM microtome. So this is something we're going to be doing more of. I'm not going to really touch on today. And then all of the ancillary equipment, which comes in any old standard Cryo-EM facility. So we also have a Pelco, which I also don't really think is sufficiently powerful. I think, yeah, Martha said that they didn't have a huge amount of luck with that. My favourite is still the trusty old Cresington, which is a fantastic device, but we also have the Glow Cube, which, again, we get really, really nice results on. We have funding for a plasma cleaner, so we don't currently have a plasma cleaner at the moment, so we're really, really interested to take opinions from anyone that has one, or maybe someone who bought one and maybe didn't make the difference you thought it would. So any opinions, I would be very grateful on those later. And finally, the final functionality which we have is cryofluorescence. So we have 2 cryofluorescence systems, and we're increasingly using these in combination with our TEM experiments to introduce a different element into those experimental regimes. And finally, on the facility, we do operate at biosafety level 2. So so for anyone who's interested in that and how we implement that, I'd be very happy to talk to you afterwards. Okay, so that's the equipment. So in terms of the team, we have 4 of us within the core electron microscopy facility team. So there's myself as facility manager, and then we have Emma and Dan also with me on team Cryo-EM. So that's the 3 of us, like I say, being cryo-focused. And I should say that Emma's 30% a postdoc, so her role is split between research and working within the facility. I'm going to talk a little bit more about training later, but Dan takes the lead on the implementation of the training, and Emma is undertaking the currently monumental task of trying to keep on top of the IT side of things and the data deluge, which again I'll talk about a little bit later. But I actually think Martin, our fantastic EM technician, has the hardest job in the facility because he deals with the real volume end of the business. So as users first come into our facility, they'll first access our T12 and our JL 1400, and it's Martin that they'll be seeing for that training. So I actually think he probably has the hardest job out of all of us. But I'll talk about the training a little bit more later. Okay, so in terms of our user base, our microscopes are University of Leeds assets, primarily funded by the University of Leeds, and so the majority of our activity is University of Leeds researchers and their collaborators. So in terms of our internal users who are based within the university, it would be no surprise that the majority of those projects are coming from the Faculty of Biological Sciences, but actually some of the most interesting projects we have through are from the schools of chemistry, physics, medicine, really strange stuff coming through from food science, which I always really enjoy. And another interesting thing to note is that if a researcher based anywhere in the world has an active collaboration with somebody at the University of Leeds, and that collaboration involves structural biology, the collaborator would be able to come to Leeds and access the equipment on essentially exactly the same terms as an internal user. And that mechanism of access is designed to promote collaborative research and to encourage people from the University of Leeds to be able to collaborate with researchers from all over the world. So I did a quick search just before this presentation, and in the last year I had 134 unique users make bookings on the system. On any system, any TEM system across the facility. So there's probably about 50 users who've made bookings or who've had bookings on the Cryosys, and I would say about 25 to 30 of those are real core Cryo-EM people, and only probably about 7 of those I would let run their entire session without any intervention whatsoever. So in terms of the microscopes, the Cryosys are probably up being used between about 75 and 88% of the time, something like that. We've got 2 microscopes. The up rates are slightly different on both of them. So we're probably averaging about 80% uptime. So of that uptime, about 80% of that time is used by our internal users, but 20% of that time is used by external service users, so people who are accessing our services on a fee-for-access basis. So these users are a mix from industry and academia. And as this is an Instruct meeting, we're about to shortly, we're finalising our ability to be able to offer access through Instruct-ERIC, which will be very exciting. So the majority of our external users come to us to set up the collection. I'd say probably about 3/4 of the time somebody actually comes to site with the samples and sits with a support scientist to set up the data collection. For internal users, a support scientist from the facility always drives the session. The people who don't come to site, it tends to be in a small number of cases because they're based on the other side of the Atlantic, which is probably a pretty good reason for not coming to not flying over. But yeah, when we have somebody who's a repeat customer and has been coming a lot, we tend to find after a couple of visits they'll just go, They know what we're looking for at that point. We've built up a bit of a relationship, and they then won't come to site. And we're very happy for them to either come or not come. That's really the user's choice. One of our main massive outstanding problems in terms of external users at the moment is that we're having to transfer those users their data using external hard drives, because at the moment the University of Leeds network is not allowing us to transfer it across the network, which is frustrating for us, and it's frustrating for the users, and it's something that we're hoping to sort out within the next couple of months or so. Finally, it's been a long time coming, so yes, fingers crossed. So I know that in the discussion session later we're going to be discussing remote viewing and remote collection. So at the moment, the only people who can drive the microscope remotely are facility staff, and we just do that currently through VNC for the FEI side and TeamViewer for the K2. If you are doing a K2 session and you have to go between the two, very annoying. So yeah, but it's something that we'll do, and especially if, so we do it if there's a snow day, and by snow day I mean like about 3 centimetres of snow, but still it's enough to shut the whole city down. So this was back in March now, where there was a very small amount of snow in the UK, and I'm pretty sure this was the same time that Dan was talking about that probably shut them down. But yes, it's quite nice. It gives you the ability to sit and do it. And it was a little bit laggy, but I think that was mostly due to my home internet than anything else. Remote customers, when we're doing the collection, we have a system where we can automatically set up a sandbox, so the data gets transferred to that, so that they can see the raw data as it's being written off, but also the pre-processed data, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later, so that they can inspect those micrographs. And something which we're looking to implement is a viewing-only VNC to mean that those users can then, be on Skype with us while we're selecting the squares, for example. But yeah, at the moment we have no plans to offer remote control for users. And we'd be really interested to see how other sites find during the implementation of this, but I think for our user group at the moment, I don't think there's a pressing desire for it, because most of them are University of Leeds based. And there's also, for us, I guess, a risk factor. There's always that thing of, what if I give control remotely to the microscope and someone presses vent the projection chamber or something terrible? So that's something that we'll be assessing on an ongoing basis. So in terms of our equipment access, so this is an Instruct sponsored meeting, and for those of you who aren't aware, Instruct have an equipment booking system which includes a booking calendar, which I think they call ARIA. So all of our equipment is on this system, and you can configure each piece of instrumentation differently. So for example, our T12, our JL 1400, users can go in and book those pieces of equipment themselves, and we can say, okay, well, you're a novice user, you can only book between 9 and 5. You're a bit more experienced, you can book outside of hours. We can put those kinds of rules into the system, which is really nice. For Titan Cryos bookings, people make booking requests to Cryo-EM at leeds.ac.uk email address, and then facility staff will slot people in based on their date preferences and those kinds of things. So at the moment, the balance of, so we roughly aim for about 80% of users to be internal and their collaborators, and then about 20% a fee for access external. But obviously month on month, quarter on quarter, we're going to have a variation in demand from those different audiences. So really at the moment, that's down to facility staff to manage and to try and balance those against each other. And then essentially we just book people in, and then every 6 months go, here's who we've got in the microscope, Neil, and Neil goes, okay, cool, excellent. But we retain that oversight from our director, who then can look at that balance and make a judgment as to whether that's right for us at the moment. Okay, so I'm going to focus the rest of my talk on our standard single particle pipelines, which is really the bread and butter of projects that come through our facility. I think that for me, and I know from many other facilities I've spoken to, that sample screening and optimization is the massive bottleneck in terms of in terms of your cryo-EM experimentation. It's like, yes, we want data collection to be more efficient and faster, and yes, we want our data processing to be faster, and that will help us get to an answer faster. But actually, in terms of what limits the number of projects going through the microscopes to success, it really is the sample optimization. So we've recently just got a new actor in the facility, which is great, because we're finding that for those really tricky macromolecular complexes where people just cannot get a good sample in ice, having it coming straight off size exclusion column as that final polishing step, literally and then literally the other side of the door, and there's the Leica or the Vitrobot, and then freezing the specimen has been the thing which has really done the trick for a couple of projects that we've had through. So we end up doing the majority of our screening in the Titan Cryoses. This is obviously like the world's biggest overkill in terms of we shouldn't be screening on a Cryos, but in terms of our instrumentation, we have 2 Cryoses, an F20, a T12, and the fact of the matter is that the majority of new users coming in don't want to spend the time to learn how to load a cryo side entry holder. And actually, it's more time and cost efficient to put them through the Cryos, as long as we can structure those screening sessions to get as much out of them as possible. So as a result, when we have a screening day, we try and get through 3 loads in a day. So there'll be a morning, an afternoon, and an evening slot. And so that means, in loading 11 grids at a time, that means we're getting through potentially up to 33 grids in a day. And then we aim for that final person to be the most promising, so that then they can set up a quick overnight run just to get an initial subset of micrographs, and that's especially useful for those borderline projects where you're looking at it going, I don't know if that's just small and flexible or whether it's just complete rubbish. So just those little short runs, even just a few hundred micrographs, is enough sometimes for you to then go on and do true declassification and say, right, well, is this worth me going back and doing a 48-hour collection? And in terms of the sample preparation, we I actually think this is somewhere that, as support scientists, this is probably where we end up spending the majority of our time having conversations with our users and saying, okay, right, well, your particle distribution isn't good because, for example, it's all stuck on or it's got preferred orientation. As Cryo-EM specialists, this huge toolbox of different options that we have open to us is kind of second nature, because people who work in facilities, we've been doing this for most of our careers. We know all of these different options in terms of glow discharge and grid types and tips and tricks and all the rest of it. But to a new user coming into the field, these are not necessarily that obvious. So one of the places that we really try and spend the time talking to our users is at this sample preparation stage. And that's something that I think we can always be improving on, but I think hopefully that's helping to get some of our more challenging projects actually up and running. Okay, so in terms of our data collection, we are primarily using the software EPU at the moment, although I'd like to propose a name change. So my Latin's not very good, so somebody might have to correct me on this one, but EPU, the motto for the United States, out of many ones, out of many particles, one structure, which I think is very poetic. So whoever within Thermo Fisher FEI decided that, top marks on the name choosing. But considering I literally just typed in Cryo-EM classification scheme onto Google, and this was the first one that came up. So considering the number of papers that have these beautiful classification schemes showing the heterogeneity in their particle sets, I feel like maybe I'm not going to try and pronounce it in Latin, but something which reflects that out of many particles, fewer structures might be even better. So in terms of our data collection, this is a meeting about Cryo-EM best practices. So when I'm thinking about in my facility, the Cryo-EM best practices, I really end up thinking about two groups of people. The first group is people who are like me, so facility staff, technical experts who are working in the facility, and the second group is our user base. So as somebody who works inside a facility, I've spent quite a lot of time thinking about how myself and my colleagues can really get the most out of our equipment. So, there's a few different things that we try and do to make sure that we as support scientists and our equipment is operating where we want it to be. So one of the things I wanted to point out is that we have 26 different parameters inside the environment of our facility monitored and alarmed. So if there is any, for example, change in the pressure of the water that's coming from our secondary chillers to the microscopes, I get a text message and I get to know about it. So we actually had about 18 alarms, and then about 4 months ago we had an event that I didn't pick up and ruined someone's data collection. So then I added a bunch more of alarms, and now I think we're hopefully going to be covered. But since the implementation of these alarms, it's amazing how we've been able to pick up potential problems before they become an actual problem with our data collection. And I'm very happy to talk to anyone about what we have monitored in place on that. From our user perspectives, I just wanted to put up this slide describing our training. So when a user enters our facility for the first time as a brand new PhD student who's going to be becoming a Cryo-EM specialist as part of their project, as we've had about 10 new starts this year who are just embarking on this journey, this is basically the route that they'll take through to their collection. Does that work? No, never mind. I'll just point. Ah, there we go. Excellent. Just warming up, I think. Fantastic. So they'll start off in the facility with a health and safety induction, and then they'll go through to, if we know that they're going to end up on the cryoses, we'll train them on the T12 just to get them used to that user interface. And essentially, at this point, the T12 and the negative stain is to really teach them the principles of the principles of microscopy and a little bit about grid handling, because there's no point trying to learn how to run before you can walk. There's no point going onto a cryos if you don't understand what eccentric height is, for example. So we try and do all of those kinds of basics at this kind of stage, and then from there they may, if they are experienced, they may go via the F20, but like I say, we're really finding that there is zero appetite for users to learn how to load a side entry holder, a cryo side entry holder. We'll train them in the grid prep, which is relatively quick, and then we just leave them to practice. And then when they get onto the Titan cryoses, we do one-on-one training based on, and the one-on-one training is done on their samples. So when we first had the cryoses, we did essentially training days where we tried to train, say, 4 people at once on how to operate it, but it wasn't on their samples, and we found that the engagement levels were horrific. We just couldn't get people to pay, to basically, and it meant that when to pay to, take away what they needed to take away from the sessions. So when they were coming on with their real samples, we were still having to support them. So we actually thought we found that training on their actual specimens is more effective for us. And this is the only, so most of our training takes a set amount of time. Our cryos training is really based on the individual. We find that some individuals require very little one-on-one training before they'll become relatively confident and competent, whereas some require a lot more. And we try to do this on like I say, on an individualized basis. And to supplement this regular training module system, which we have, where training is run every week, we hold training courses. So we hold internal training courses, which include lectures about twice a year, but we also are starting to now think about our external training provision. So one thing that we're doing in conjunction with the Royal Microscopy Society is we have our very, very first single particle Cryo-EM school in December of this year. We're very excited to have 15 people from across Europe, really, and from different backgrounds, academia, industry, coming to these. So I think, so I just wanted to highlight that. It's fully subscribed this year, but it's something that I think we're hoping to be maybe getting involved more in the context of what else is happening in terms of the UK and European training environment. Okay, so we've had our user. Our users come through this training thing, and they've learnt how to make grids, and then they've screened their grids, and they've got a nice micrograph showing that there's good particles, and now they're going to, for the first time in their life, they're going to go and set up EPU. And basically, this is what a standard user looks like when they come into the facility at that stage. There's shock and awe and confusion, because there's a lot of questions. And this is where, if somebody who spent a lot of time in Cryo-EM, you're going to look at this and go, okay, right, well, I can break down all of these without even really thinking about it. I can say, right, well, this is a good way for me to go forward. But for a new user, a new PhD student who might just be a few months into their projects, there is a massive question, just how do I do this? There's so many variables. Stop it. So this was a meme that one of my PhD students, a PhD student in the facility, made for me. And I think that as somebody who is familiar with many of the concepts in the field, we kind of forget sometimes maybe how overwhelming all of these options can be. Because, to me, I think, okay, well, EPU, it's a friendly, GUI-based system, everything's fine, but, we get a lot of users, even when they're quite confident up until this point, getting quite overwhelmed at the data collection stage. So, at around the time the 2 cryoses were installed, there was a period of time of about 5-6 months where it was just myself supporting 2 cryoses. And that, out of sheer desperation at that stage, I started to develop a standard operating procedure for use of our Titan cryoses. This has evolved into a protocol which we've recently just had accepted into Nature Protocols. I'd be very surprised if at least one of the reviewers wasn't in the room. So if you are in the room, thank you very much. I probably owe you a drink. So come and for your very useful comments. So yeah, please come and talk to me about it. But yeah, so we basically developed standard operating procedures for EPU setup on the K2 and the Falcon 3. And we basically produce this for 2 main reasons: as a teaching aid and also as a resource for external users, because we had a significant number of external service users coming in and saying, okay, well, I want to think ahead of time as to what I want to do. Is there a manual? Can you send me something? And the EPU manual has a statement at the beginning saying it's not for circulation outside of your institution. What are you going to do? So we weren't able to circulate that. So we now have essentially this standard operating procedure which we work from. It's not perfect, and my primary concerns around it are that around users not having a clear idea about why they're making certain choices, for example, and I worry about training a community of users who really understands what they're trying to do and why they're making certain choices, rather than saying, well, I did it because that's what the protocol said. But I think there's a real balance to be made between we need to implement something to enable a wider number of users to access this technology. So as part of this protocol, we insist that every user fills out, or facility staff for an external provides a user data sheet off at the end of every session. So it's something we implemented a while ago, and it's been one of the most trivial things that we've implemented, and it's made such a massive difference because it stops those, ooh, what was my dose per physical pixel again? I wrote down my dose per angstrom squared, but I didn't write down this, and now I need to go and back work it out or whatever. So we basically just make everyone write it down before they leave, and that makes a big difference. So I just wanted to say a couple of words on detector choice. So we have a K2 and a Falcon 3 EC. The internal users are pretty evenly spread across the two of them. But probably the way in which we set ourselves apart from other facilities is that we primarily run our Falcon 3 in integrating mode or linear mode. And obviously, you can get very lovely, this was actually work done about a year and a half ago now. Obviously, you can get lovely structures if your thing is big. But actually, we're using the Falcon 3 in integrating mode for things which are probably traditionally considered a bit smaller. So, for example, we have we have this 200 kilodalton soluble protein, and the kind of average resolution was around 3.5 angstroms. So yes, so basically, even on we're finding that this detector in this mode performs really quite nicely on things which are this kind of size. And if it means you need a big particle stack, for example, you think you need a lot of heterogeneity, Falcon 3 in integrating mode with EPU is fast. So we can go up to 170 images an hour, which is a lot. So yeah, I just wanted to say that because I think that is somewhere where we differ from some other facilities. So obviously, we have a lot of data come off these microscopes, and just for the discussions, I wanted to just say quickly how we deal with that. So our system is not super sexy and super modular and amazing, but it's something that we've kind of put together and is relatively robust and works quite well for us. So we use a series of scripts to move our data across onto our GPFS file storage system, where the data is then split and the data is processed from symbolic links, so it kind of protects the raw data. From there, we rely on batch functionality and use Motion Core 2 and GCTF. And the nice thing about the version of GCTF which we're using for this pipeline is that it outputs a kind of nominal maximum resolution in the micrograph. So as part of our automated scripting, it writes out these reports on micrograph quality. So this was one that we did, this was like a test one. And basically the chiller was broken. So you can see what an effect like poor lens cooling has on the average sort of resolution in your micrograph. And you could say that this one, we could say, well, we need to have a look at this because there's clearly kind of a bimodal distribution there. And where this has really made a massive difference for us is phase shift and monitoring our phase shift over time. In terms of the speed of our on-the-fly system, it basically keeps up in real time. So the results from this are about 5 minutes lagged from what's coming off the microscope, which is pretty good. But our system's not perfect, and we'd like to, we're very, very interested in how other sites are dealing with this. We're finding that our system is requiring far too many manual updates when things change and new things come in, so we're working on making it a bit more robust and a bit more modular, introducing new functionalities, and this is a script written by Matt Udanza, which basically automatically finds micrographs with crystalline icing so they can be excluded before the particle picking stage, for example. Okay, so that's basically all of the topics I wanted to cover today. I guess there's a little bit of a summary of the things which are the biggest challenges and the biggest kind of things going forward. Efficient screening for us, it continues to be a massive challenge. Having these focused screening days and the overnight collections helps, but I suspect in our case, with 2 Titan Cryoses and then 3 kind of side entry holder microscopes, our F20 was purchased back in 2002 now, so as much as I love it, and it's my microscope that I trained on, I think we may have to say goodbye to that at some point and think about replacing it with something with an autoloader and pushing the screening activity onto that microscope. We put an enormous amount of time and effort at Leeds into developing these standard operating procedures and training resources, and I know that other sites do the same as well. And I've mentioned that we're going to be publishing one of those in a journal, but actually it's going to become outdated basically as soon as it's published. So I'm really interested in the discussion sessions and is talking about what is the best way of us being able to share these standard operating procedures, sharing best practice, because I think that's going to be something really important going forwards. Yeah, it's a single particle on the fly. is something that I'm very going to be very interested in the talks tomorrow, for example, and to see how everyone else is doing that. But for us, I think our tomography work is about to expand exponentially. Not quite exponentially, but I suspect that in next year it will probably represent about 30% of our activities, something like that, looking at the projects coming through. And a big piece of work for us at the moment is putting in place these on-the-fly pipelines for assessing tomography data on the fly, which is a whole new challenge for us. So I'd be very interested in hearing if anyone has done any of that, or if, for example, you're having more success using NOVA CTF for estimating phase shifts, for example. Finally, I've mentioned that we primarily use EPU for single particle collection. We use Cryo-EM and TOMO for tilt series collection. I'm going to be very interested to hear in the next talk about whether perhaps we should be considering using Cryo-EM a bit more routinely for single particle. Okay, so with that, I'm going to finish. I'd just like to thank all of the fantastic people who work within the EM facility and our broader community. We're extremely fortunate to have a group of very lovely and helpful and collegiate people who are very good at sharing best practice and sitting together in the office and helping each other. We're directed by Neil Ranson, who's just at the top there, and I presented work from Steve's group for the Timeresolved device. So that's it. Thank you for your attention. Any questions? And also we're on Twitter, so like everyone else. So yeah, tweet us.